The steady rhythm of rain against windows had become Ethan Carter's only companion in his small Seattle apartment. Another rejection letter lay crumpled on his desk, joining a growing collection of similar disappointments. His latest manuscript, a story he'd poured his heart into for the past 18 months, had been deemed lacking authenticity by yet another publishing house. The words echoed in his mind as he stared at the blank document on his computer screen, the cursor blinking mockingly. Running his fingers through his disheveled brown hair, Ethan pushed away from his desk. The walls of his apartment seemed to close in around him, suffocating his creativity with each passing moment. He needed air, space, anything to escape the crushing weight of his failures. Without bothering to grab an umbrella, he stepped out into the gray Seattle afternoon, letting the cool droplets wash over him. His feet carried him through familiar streets, past coffee shops where other writers sat typing away on their laptops, their faces illuminated by the soft glow of success he couldn't seem to capture. The irony wasn't lost on him. Here he was, in a city known for nurturing literary giants, yet he couldn't even get a single publisher to take a chance on his work. The universe, however, had other plans for Ethan that day. A sudden gust of wind sent a piece of paper flying into his face, temporarily blinding him. As he peeled it away, his eyes focused on the words, "Give a voice to the voiceless, Seattle Animal Shelter Adoption Day." He looked up to find himself standing before a modest building he'd passed countless times, but never truly noticed. Something pulled him inside, perhaps curiosity, perhaps destiny, disguised as coincidence. The cacophony of barking dogs and meowing cats greeted him, but amidst the chaos, his attention was drawn to a peculiar silence in one corner. There, in a kennel slightly removed from the others, sat a dog with graying fur and eyes that seemed to hold the wisdom of ages. The nameplate read Duke, and unlike the other dogs who jumped and barked for attention, this one simply watched. There was something in those eyes that spoke to Ethan, something that reminded him of the way he felt when reading his favorite author's works, a depth of understanding that transcended ordinary communication. "He's been here longer than most," a shelter volunteer named Sarah explained, noticing Ethan's interest. "Been adopted twice, but always ends up back here. It's like he's waiting for someone specific." She paused, studying Ethan's face. "You're the first person he's actually maintained eye contact with." Ethan knelt before the kennel, and Duke moved closer, his tail offering a gentle wag. "What's his story?" Ethan asked, unable to shake the feeling that there was more to this dog than met the eye. Sarah's expression shifted, becoming more guarded. "We don't know much. He was found wandering near a bookstore in Portland about a year ago. No collar, no chip, but clearly well-trained. He has these quirks. Sometimes he reacts to things in ways we can't explain." As if on cue, Duke's ears perked up at the mention of Portland, and his eyes seemed to hold a question that Ethan couldn't quite decipher. The writer in him couldn't help but see the beginning of a story, one that needed to be told. Before he could second-guess himself, Ethan heard his own voice saying, "I'll adopt him." The words surprised him as much as they seemed to please Duke, whose tail wagging increased ever so slightly. The paperwork was surprisingly simple, as if the universe was afraid he might change his mind if given too much time to think. Within an hour, Ethan found himself walking home with Duke by his side, both of them somehow knowing that this was more than just a simple adoption. Back in his apartment, Duke didn't behave like a typical rescue dog. He didn't explore his new surroundings or show any anxiety about the change. Instead, he walked directly to Ethan's writing desk and sat beside it, his eyes fixed on the blank computer screen as if he could read the stories that had yet to be written. That night, as Ethan lay in bed trying to sleep, he could hear Duke pacing in the living room, stopping occasionally as if listening for something. The dog's behavior was odd, but not threatening, more like someone guarding a secret they weren't quite ready to share. Little did Ethan know that Duke's arrival would unlock a mystery that had been waiting years to be solved, and that his life as a struggling writer was about to become entangled with a story far more compelling than anything he could have imagined. If this story has captured your interest, don't forget to subscribe to our channel and give it a like. Tell us which city you're watching from. Let's continue. The following weeks brought subtle changes to Ethan's life. Duke's presence seemed to alter the very atmosphere of his small apartment, filling it with an inexplicable sense of purpose. The dog's peculiar behaviors became more pronounced, revealing layers of mystery that left Ethan increasingly intrigued. During his writing sessions, Duke would sit perfectly still, his eyes fixed on the screen with an almost human-like concentration, only to suddenly perk up at the mention of certain words or phrases. One particularly frustrating morning, as Ethan struggled with yet another rejection letter, his phone rang. The number was unfamiliar, and the voice on the other end belonged to a woman who introduced herself as Margaret Holloway. Her tone carried an urgency that made Ethan's heart skip a beat. "Mr. Carter, I apologize for tracking you down like this, but I believe you have something that belongs to my family," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "A dog named Duke." Ethan glanced at Duke, who had suddenly appeared at his side, ears forward and alert. "Yes, I adopted him from the Seattle shelter about a month ago." "How did you—" "He belonged to my grandfather, Charles Holloway," Margaret interrupted, the name hanging in the air like a thunderclap. Ethan's grip on the phone tightened. Charles Holloway, the literary giant whose works had inspired him to become a writer in the first place. The man whose masterful storytelling had guided him through countless lonely nights, showing him the power of words to transform lives. "Charles Holloway," Ethan managed to say, his voice barely above a whisper. "The author of Midnight Whispers and The Echo of Silence?" "The very same," Margaret confirmed. "And Duke was more than just his companion. He was his secret keeper." As if responding to his former owner's name, Duke let out a soft whine, his eyes fixed on Ethan with an intensity that seemed to convey volumes of unspoken information. Margaret continued, explaining that she had been searching for Duke ever since her grandfather's passing, following a trail that had gone cold multiple times. "There's something you need to know," she said, her voice heavy with significance. "My grandfather's last manuscript, it was never published. Pages were missing, crucial parts of the story just gone. He always said Duke would know how to find the right person, but none of us understood what he meant." Ethan's writer's instinct tingled. He thought about the way Duke had reacted to his writing, the strange moments of recognition, the almost supernatural awareness the dog seemed to possess. "Would it be possible for us to meet?" he asked, already reaching for his notebook. They arranged to meet at a small cafe the next day, but sleep eluded Ethan that night. He pulled out his collection of Charles Holloway's books, reading passages he had memorized years ago with fresh eyes. As he flipped through the pages of The Echo of Silence, something caught his attention, a pattern he had never noticed before. Certain words seemed to stand out, not in their meaning, but in their placement. The first letters of consecutive chapters spelled out what appeared to be a name. Duke watched from his spot near the bookshelf, his eyes reflecting the dim light of Ethan's desk lamp. When Ethan read particular passages aloud, the dog's reactions were unmistakable. Subtle shifts in posture, changes in breathing, the occasional soft whine. "You know something, don't you?" Ethan whispered to Duke, who responded by placing his paw on one of the open books. The gesture was so deliberate, so precise, that it sent chills down Ethan's spine. Morning found Ethan exhausted but buzzing with anticipation. He had spent hours examining Charles Holloway's works, finding more patterns, more clues that seemed to point to something larger than a simple literary mystery. As he prepared to meet Margaret, he couldn't shake the feeling that he was being pulled into a story that had been waiting years to be told. Duke's behavior that morning was different too. He paced the apartment with renewed energy, stopping occasionally to stare at Ethan with what could only be described as encouragement. When it was time to leave, the dog sat by the door, clearly expecting to join the meeting. "You're part of this story too, aren't you?" Ethan asked, reaching for Duke's leash. The dog's tail wagged once deliberately, as if confirming a truth that was only beginning to unfold. The cafe where Margaret had chosen to meet was tucked away in a quiet corner of Seattle, its weathered brick exterior suggesting decades of whispered conversations and shared secrets. As Ethan approached with Duke by his side, he spotted an elegant woman in her early 40s sitting at an outdoor table, her fingers nervously tracing the rim of an untouched coffee cup. The moment Margaret saw Duke, her composure cracked. "Oh my God," she whispered, tears welling in her eyes. "It really is you." Duke's reaction was equally telling. His tail wagged slowly, and he approached her with a familiarity that confirmed their shared past. Once seated, Margaret pulled out a worn leather portfolio. "These were my grandfather's personal notes," she explained, handling the papers with reverence. He spent his final years obsessed with completing his last novel, but something was holding him back. He kept saying he needed to find Daniel first. "Daniel?" Ethan asked, watching as Duke's ears perked up at the name. Margaret's expression darkened. "My uncle, Charles's only son. He disappeared over 20 years ago." The official story was that he left to pursue his own writing career, away from my grandfather's shadow. But there was more to it. There had to be. She spread out several yellowed papers on the table. Ethan recognized Charles Holloway's distinctive handwriting, the same confident strokes that had signed countless first editions. But these pages were different. They were filled with what appeared to be codes, references to his published works, and strange circular patterns that connected different passages. "Look at this," Margaret pointed to a particular note. "My grandfather wrote, 'The truth lies in the spaces between words, in the silence between chapters.' Duke knows. He's always known." She looked at the dog, who sat alertly between them. "We thought it was the ramblings of a grieving father, but now I'm not so sure." Ethan shared his own discoveries about the patterns in Charles's books, the hidden names, the carefully placed clues. Margaret listened intently, her coffee growing cold and forgotten. "There's something else," she said finally, pulling out a photograph. It showed a younger Charles Holloway in his study, with Duke lying at his feet. But what caught Ethan's attention was the collection of books visible in the background, specifically their arrangement. "These books," he said, pointing to the photo, "they're not arranged alphabetically or by publication date. Look at the titles. If you take the first letter of each one, they spell out an address in Portland." Margaret's eyes widened. "The bookstore where Duke was found," she breathed. It couldn't be a coincidence. As they pored over more documents, a clearer picture began to emerge. Charles hadn't simply been writing his last novel. He had been weaving an elaborate message into his entire body of work, creating a literary treasure map that only the right person could decode. "There's something about Daniel that my grandfather never told anyone," Margaret confided, her voice dropping to a whisper, "something that happened just before he disappeared. I was young, but I remember overhearing arguments about a manuscript, not my grandfather's, but Daniel's." Duke, who had been lying quietly at their feet, suddenly stood and nosed at the portfolio, causing several papers to scatter. As Ethan helped gather them, he noticed something fall from between the pages. A small, worn notebook that looked different from the others. "I've never seen this before," Margaret said, reaching for it. The notebook contained what appeared to be early drafts of a story, written in a different hand than Charles's. The prose was raw, powerful, and hauntingly familiar to Ethan. It reminded him of his own early attempts at writing, full of passion and barely contained emotion. "This is Daniel's, isn't it?" he asked. Though he already knew the answer, Duke's tail wagged once, confirming. The last page of the notebook contained a single line. Some stories are better left untold. But beneath it, barely visible in the paper's worn crease, was a series of numbers that looked like dates, corresponding to the publication dates of Charles's most famous works. Your grandfather wasn't just leaving breadcrumbs, Ethan realized, excitement building in his voice. He was creating a map, using his own published works as landmarks. But why? What was he trying to lead us to? Margaret's reply was interrupted by Duke's sudden bark, the first time Ethan had ever heard him make such a sound. The dog was staring intently at a particular page that had fallen to the ground, his paw firmly placed on what appeared to be a handwritten note in the margin. The truth about DH must remain hidden until the right moment. The final chapter depends on it. The discovery of Daniel's notebook changed everything. Back in his apartment, Ethan spread Charles Holloway's books across his desk, arranging them according to their publication dates. Duke sat beside him, watching intently as he cross-referenced the dates from the notebook with specific passages from each novel. "It's like a puzzle box," Ethan muttered, flipping through the pages of Midnight Whispers. Each book seemed to contain a piece of a larger message, carefully woven into the narrative. The dates weren't random. They led to specific chapters. And within those chapters, certain words stood out in ways that seemed deliberate. His phone buzzed with a text from Margaret. "Found something in grandfather's study. Coming over." 20 minutes later, she arrived clutching a weathered leather journal, her face flushed with excitement. "This was his personal diary," she explained, carefully opening it. "I've read it dozens of times, but after our conversation today, certain entries took on a new meaning." She pointed to a passage dated just weeks before Daniel's disappearance. "My son believes he's living in my shadow, but he doesn't understand. He's always been the light casting it." Duke moved closer, his nose touching the diary's pages as if he could read the words himself. Margaret continued turning pages until she reached an entry that made her pause. "Listen to this. D thinks his manuscript was rejected because of me. He doesn't know I tried to protect him. Some truths are too dangerous to publish." Ethan felt a chill run down his spine. What kind of truth could be dangerous enough to make someone disappear? The answer began to take shape as they delved deeper into Charles's diary. References to the truth about the Henderson case appeared repeatedly, always in connection with Daniel's manuscript. A quick internet search revealed that 20 years ago, Henderson Publishing had been at the center of a controversial lawsuit, though most of the details were surprisingly hard to find. "Wait," Ethan said, something clicking in his mind. He pulled out his own rejection letters, scanning through them until he found what he was looking for. 3 of these rejections came from subsidiaries of Henderson Publishing. That can't be a coincidence. Duke suddenly stood, walking to Ethan's bookshelf and poring at a specific volume, Charles's The Echo of Silence. The book fell open to a page where a single sentence seemed to leap out. "The truth hides in plain sight, wearing the mask of fiction." Margaret's hands trembled as she read from another diary entry. "I've hidden the key where only the right person will find it. The one who understands that every story is a door, and every door needs the right key to unlock it." As if responding to these words, Duke trotted to Ethan's laptop and nudged it with his nose. The blank document that had tormented Ethan for so long now seemed like an invitation rather than a barrier. "Your grandfather wasn't just leaving clues about Daniel's whereabouts," Ethan realized, his writer's instinct firing on all cylinders. He was protecting something bigger, something that Daniel discovered and tried to expose through his writing. Margaret nodded slowly. "The Henderson case. I remember my mother mentioning it once. She said it nearly ruined grandfather's career, but he never explained why he defended them. Everyone thought he had betrayed his principles." Ethan began typing, transcribing passages from Charles's books that contained the hidden patterns. As the words appeared on screen, Duke's behavior became more animated. He moved between the scattered books and the laptop, as if confirming each connection. "Look at this," Ethan said, pointing to his screen. "If we take the marked passages in chronological order, they form a completely different narrative. It's not just about finding Daniel. It's about exposing the truth he discovered." A sudden knock at the door made them all freeze. Duke's posture changed instantly, his body tense and alert. Margaret moved to answer it, but Ethan held up his hand. Through the peephole, he could see a man in a business suit, holding what appeared to be a legal document. "Mr. Carter?" the man called out. "I represent Henderson Publishing. We need to discuss your recent manuscript submissions and some concerning similarities to other works." Duke's low growl confirmed what Ethan already suspected. They were getting too close to something that powerful people wanted to keep hidden. As he and Margaret stood in tense silence, the pieces of the puzzle were finally starting to form a clear picture. But the image they revealed was more disturbing than either of them had imagined. The man from Henderson Publishing remained at the door for what felt like an eternity before finally leaving. In the tense silence that followed, Ethan and Margaret worked quickly, gathering the most important documents and Charles's diary. Duke watched their every move, his behavior suggesting he understood the urgency of their situation. "We need to go somewhere safe," Margaret whispered, her hands shaking as she helped Ethan pack his laptop. "I have a cabin just outside the city. Grandfather used it as a writing retreat." The drive to the cabin was filled with nervous glances in the rearview mirror, but no one seemed to be following them. Duke sat alertly in the back seat, his eyes fixed on the road ahead. As they traveled further from Seattle, Ethan's mind raced through everything they'd uncovered. The cabin proved to be a modest but well-maintained structure nestled among towering pine trees. The moment they stepped inside, Duke's behavior changed dramatically. He moved through the space with familiar purpose, heading straight for a specific bookshelf in the study. "This was where Grandfather wrote his last complete novel," Margaret explained, running her fingers along the desk's worn surface. "He spent months here, saying he needed to be away from distractions to finish his work." Duke's persistent pawing at the bookshelf drew their attention. When Ethan moved closer to investigate, he noticed something odd about the way the books were arranged. Just like in the photograph they'd seen earlier, these volumes seemed to be placed in a specific pattern. "Help me take these down," he said to Margaret. As they removed the books one by one, Duke's excitement grew. Behind the last volume, hidden in a recessed compartment, they found a manila envelope. Inside was a manuscript, not Charles's missing work, but something else entirely. The title page read, "The Price of Silence" by Daniel Holloway. "This is it," Margaret breathed. "This is what Daniel was working on before he disappeared." As they began reading, the true scope of what they'd stumbled upon became clear. Daniel's manuscript wasn't just a novel, it was an exposé disguised as fiction. Through carefully crafted metaphors and symbolic characters, he had documented a massive fraud scheme orchestrated by Henderson Publishing. They weren't just a publishing house, Ethan realized, piecing it together. They were using books to launder money. Bestseller lists were manipulated, sales figures inflated. "And your grandfather was trying to protect Daniel," Margaret finished. "By making it look like he was siding with Henderson, he was actually buying time to help Daniel document everything." Duke whined softly, drawing their attention to a particular page where a handwritten note was tucked into the margin. "The final proof is in the place where stories begin." CH. Ethan's hands trembled as he read Daniel's words. The manuscript was brilliant, not just in its exposition of corruption, but in its crafting. The writing style was hauntingly familiar, reminiscent of passages he'd read in Charles's published works. "Look at these chapters," he said suddenly. "The structure, The way the revelations are layered, it's exactly like how your grandfather wrote The Echo of Silence. He didn't just hide Daniel's manuscript. He took elements of it and wove them into his own books, preserving the truth in plain sight. Margaret's eyes widened. That's why he was so insistent about Duke finding the right person. He needed someone who could not only find the manuscript, but understand its true significance. Someone who could see the patterns. Someone who could finish what Daniel started. Ethan completed, understanding dawning in his eyes. Your grandfather's last unpublished work, it wasn't just an unfinished novel. It was the key to bringing everything together. Duke barked once sharply and ran to another room. They followed to find him scratching at a loose floorboard. Beneath it lay Charles Holloway's final manuscript, its pages yellowed but intact. But what caught their attention was the handwritten note attached to its cover. To the one who finds this, the story isn't over. Daniel didn't disappear. He's been hiding in the one place they'd never think to look. The final chapter can only be written when the truth leads us home. The phrase, "the place where stories begin," echoed in Ethan's mind as he paced the cabin study. Duke watched him intently, those knowing eyes following his every move. Margaret sat at her grandfather's desk, poring over both manuscripts, Daniel's explosive exposé and Charles's final work. "I don't understand," she said, frustration evident in her voice. "If grandfather knew where Daniel was all this time, why didn't he just tell us?" "Because he couldn't," Ethan replied, the pieces finally clicking into place. The moment he revealed Daniel's location, everything would have been compromised. He needed to wait until the truth about Henderson could be exposed safely. He paused, looking at Duke. "That's why he trusted you, wasn't it, boy? You were the only one who could recognize the right person." Duke's tail wagged once, deliberately. Ethan turned back to his laptop, where he'd been analyzing the patterns in Charles's books. The place where stories begin, it's not a physical location. It's about where the inspiration comes from. He pulled up his own rejection letters, scanning them again with fresh eyes. "All my manuscripts were rejected for the same reason, lacking authenticity." Margaret looked up sharply. "Just like they said about Daniel's early work." "Exactly, but look at this." Ethan opened one of his files, displaying a story he'd written months ago. "I never understood why this felt so natural to write. The words just flowed, like they were already there, waiting to be found." Duke suddenly stood, walking to Ethan's bag where his earliest manuscripts were stored. With gentle teeth, he pulled out the oldest one, a story Ethan had written in college, one that had given him the confidence to pursue writing as a career. Margaret took the manuscript, her hands shaking slightly as she began to read. Her eyes widened. This writing style, it's just like Daniel's. Not just similar, it's identical. Ethan felt a strange sensation wash over him as the final truth emerged. "I was adopted," he said quietly. "I never knew my birth parents. All I had was this strange pull toward writing and an inexplicable connection to Charles Holloway's books." Duke moved to his side, pressing against his leg in a gesture of confirmation. Margaret's eyes filled with tears as she looked at him, really looked at him for the first time. "You have his eyes," she whispered. "Daniel's eyes. How did we not see it before?" The revelation struck like lightning. Ethan Carter wasn't just a struggling writer who happened to adopt the right dog. He was Daniel Holloway's son, hidden in plain sight, protected by an elaborate plan set in motion decades ago. Charles wasn't just my literary hero, Ethan realized, his voice thick with emotion. He was my grandfather. He made sure I would find my way back, but only when the time was right. Only when I was ready to understand the truth and strong enough to expose it. Duke barked softly, as if in agreement. All those hours watching Ethan write, all those subtle reactions to certain words and phrases. The dog hadn't just been observing. He had been guarding, protecting, waiting for the moment when the last piece would fall into place. Margaret reached for Charles's final manuscript. "This isn't just an unfinished story," she said. "It's your inheritance. The last chapter was always meant to be written by you." With trembling fingers, Ethan opened his laptop. The blank document that had tormented him for so long now felt like an open door. Duke settled beside him, just as he had done every day since his adoption, but now their connection held a deeper meaning. "We'll need help to expose Henderson," Margaret said, her voice steady with determination. "But with both manuscripts and all the evidence Grandfather collected, we have everything we need," Ethan finished. "And more importantly, we have the truth. The story Daniel, my father, started, I can finally help him finish it." As the sun set outside the cabin's windows, Ethan began to write. The words flowed naturally, carrying the weight of 3 generations of storytellers. Duke rested his head on Ethan's knee, his mission finally complete. The lost son had found his way home, and the final chapter was about to be written. In that quiet moment, surrounded by the legacy of his family's words and courage, Ethan understood that some stories were meant to stay hidden until the right moment. Some truths needed time to emerge. And sometimes, the most powerful tales were the ones that wrote themselves in the spaces between words, in the silence between chapters, in the mysterious ways that love and truth find their way home. Dear readers, if this story has touched your heart, please don't forget to subscribe to our channel and give it a thumbs up. We believe in the power of storytelling to reveal truths and bring people together. Share your thoughts in the comments below. What family secrets have shaped your own story? Remember to turn on notifications so you don't miss our next tale of mystery, love, and redemption. Until then, keep believing in the magic of untold stories waiting to be discovered.